All right, let's get right into it. Today we're tackling a really tough but super important topic, obstetric violence. But we're coming at it from a pretty unique angle. What happens when the very evidence that proves a global crisis is, well, a crisis itself? So get this, a huge review of studies on this topic found that in some places the rate of obstetric violence could be as high as 59%. That's nearly 6 out of every 10 women. It's a massive number, and it seems to confirm what people have been shouting about for years. But yeah, this is where our story starts to get a little tricky.
And here's the kicker, the real paradox of it all. The exact same scientific report that gives us this alarming number also completely tears apart its own evidence. It basically says, hey, this is a huge problem, but by the way, all the data we use to prove it is kind of broken. So what do you do with that?
Okay, but before we get lost in the data debate, let's be super clear on one thing. The core problem, it's not up for debate.
So just so we're all on the same page, obstetric violence, or OV, is basically the mistreatment, disrespect, and abuse that women can face during childbirth in a healthcare setting. And this big review, it leaves zero doubt that this is happening all over the world. It's a serious violation of human rights, plain and simple.
So, right. The problem is real, no one's arguing that. But the data, the numbers we use to figure out how big this problem is, that's where we hit that paradox.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly, right? On one side, you have this huge finding, a widespread global human rights violation. But on the other side, the data that got us there is officially labeled critically low quality. So how on earth are we supposed to square those two things?
And if you want to see just how shaky that foundation is, look at this. This table breaks down the quality ratings for the 14 big reviews the report was based on. You see that? Only one was rated high quality. The majority, 8 of them, were rated critically low. I mean, in science, that's like trying to build a skyscraper on quicksand.
Which brings us to the absolute core of this whole dilemma, and there are two really strong arguments here. With data this flawed, can we really use it to make policy right now? Or do we have to hit pause and wait for better numbers?
So let's dig into that first argument, the Act Now camp. These are the folks who say, flawed or not, we have to do something immediately.
Their whole position is basically this. Waiting for perfect data is a privilege we just don't have when women are actively being harmed. They argue that the patterns we see, the types of abuse, the people most at risk, are so consistent across all these studies that you can't ignore them.
And they point to really powerful stuff like this. These numbers consistently show who's getting hit the hardest. If you have complications during birth or have less education, your risk can be 6 times higher. If you're in a public hospital or have a lower income, it's 4 times higher. You know, these aren't just random blips in the data. This is a clear, repeating signal that the system is failing specific groups of people.
And here's a really interesting twist. You'd think that the fact the studies didn't overlap much would be a weakness, right? But the Act Now side says it's actually a strength. It means all these different researchers, looking at different groups of women in different places, all ended up pointing to the very same risk factors. That convergence makes the findings even more convincing, not less.
And look, at the end of the day, their argument comes down to this. Some things are just fundamentally wrong. You don't need a perfect statistic to know that. The review confirmed horrible things. Women being literally tied to beds, forced sterilizations, women being held in hospitals because they couldn't pay their bill. These aren't statistical debates. They're clear-cut human rights violations that have to be stopped. Period.
Okay, but there is a really compelling counter-argument. This is the wait for certainty camp, and they're urging caution, saying we need to get the science right before we act.
Their biggest fear is this. Good intentions are not enough. If our numbers are all over the place, if our measurements are unreliable, then any policies we create based on them are just bound to fail. We could end up wasting precious time and money on solutions that don't actually fix the problem.
And this chart, it just shows you the problem in a nutshell. When researchers tried to measure just physical violence, the numbers they came back with were everywhere, from as low as 3% to as high as almost 80%. I mean, that's chaos. It tells you that nobody is even agreeing on what they're measuring. Are we talking about a rough touch or something far worse? If you can't define the problem, how can you possibly solve it?
And these are the nitty-gritty methodological flaws that have scientists worried. We're talking about basic stuff, like not registering study plans ahead of time, which can lead to cherry-picking data. We're not accounting for known biases. To a policymaker who relies on solid evidence, these are huge red flags. It just makes the final numbers feel untrustworthy.
Plus, there's this problem of just lumping everything together. This side argues that you can't take data from a super under-resourced clinic in one part of the world and a state-of-the-art hospital in another and mash it all into one global statistic. It erases all the crucial local details you need to make smart, effective policies on the ground.
So you've got these two very strong, very valid arguments pulling in opposite directions. Where does that leave us? How do we find a way forward that respects both the urgency of the problem and the need for good data?
Well, it starts with the common ground, and there is some. Both sides agree 100% that obstetric violence is real, it's serious, and it's complicated. And they also agree that it's rooted in deeper structural problems, things like power imbalances in the healthcare system and social inequality.
And when it comes to the data, the review itself actually lays out a plan. It calls for a methodological cleanup. And that basically means we need to do three things. First, agree on a standard definition of what OV actually is. Second, create and test tools that can measure it reliably. And third, start building a foundation of solid, comparable data that we can all trust.
So in the end, it's not really about choosing one side or the other. It's about doing two things at once. It's a dual imperative. We absolutely have to act now to stop the most horrific, undeniable abuses, the stuff that nobody needs a study to tell them is wrong. And at the exact same time, we have to roll up our sleeves and do the hard work of building better data for the future so our long-term solutions are smart and effective.
And this whole thing really just shines a light on this fundamental tension in so many fields, right? Not just this one. And it leaves us with this really big final question to chew on. When human lives are actually on the line, but your evidence is imperfect, how much certainty is enough?
The measurement tools are all over the place, and you can't really fight a problem if you can't accurately and reliably measure it first.
And that leads directly to the roadmap they propose. First, the global community has to agree on one standardized definition of obstetric violence. Step 2, we have to improve the quality of the research being done. And step 3, once we have that solid foundation, we can finally start to develop interventions that are actually based on evidence, not just on good intentions.
We've seen the definition, the scale, and the devastating reality of obstetric violence. It all brings us back to this one essential question. The research gives us the map, but the journey to making sure every single birth is safe and respectful, that requires massive systemic change and a collective demand from all of us for something better.